On this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, we speak with Quali on the benefits of sandboxes to ensure smooth SDN and NFV deployments. All right, well, thanks for joining us on this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer. This week we are joined by Joan Wrabetz, who's the CTO of Quali, to talk a bit about the company and also its work in terms of sandboxes and different ways to kind of help companies get involved and troubleshoot and test their virtualization and software deployments. So Joan, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Very good. Well, maybe start off with a little overview of the company for those who maybe don't know much about Quali, what you guys do, maybe how you, the formation behind the company there, and maybe your target market, I guess, as well.
Sure. So Quali started in Israel about 9 years ago and expanded globally, and now we have a presence worldwide and global customer base. We're proud to say that actually 20% of the global 100 are customers of ours. This is designed so you can do your own math. We now have our headquarters in Santa Clara, California, and our engineering design center is in Israel. We started out building this idea of a cloud sandbox as a way to automate network configurations on the fly. But as data center infrastructure has evolved from being purely physical networks to being sort of virtual networks and even cloud and as a service, we evolved our platform to be more around automating a full stack environment from the layer 1 network all the way up through applications. And so that was a big evolution for us. And the second thing is that as the industry is now embracing hybrid cloud infrastructure, we're kind of leading the way in making it possible to create a hybrid cloud in a sandbox as well. So automation's kind of always been our center point, and sandboxes are kind of how we do it. And often our customers start using sandboxes to automate one function like testing. But as they're moving toward DevOps and they break down barriers, they often start to apply our automation across functional groups and even as a built-in part of their DevOps lifecycle. So now we are evolved to providing kind of all aspects of automation across a variety of DevOps functions, from development, test, IT staging, even things like demos and POCs, which are really business operations, are all use cases for sandboxes. What differentiates us, our target markets are telcos and service providers. In fact, that is where we started. So we're proud to say that 7 of the 10 top 10 telcos in the world are customers of ours and have been customers of ours for a while. We also sold to tech companies, starting with network equipment manufacturers, and more recently to enterprises, as digitization has kind of happened, and every enterprise is, in a sense, a software company. Our differentiator is really along the 2 lines I described. We help people build and replicate full stack environments from networks to applications, and we let them do it in a hybrid environment. And to sort of apply that to the NFV space, obviously as telcos shift to NFV, they're shifting from from physical to virtual networks, and usually a mix, actually. And those virtual network functions are starting to look like multi-tier applications too. You'll find a virtual CPE that's actually 8 VMs, for example, and they're connected in a very specific way. So they really are starting to have to think like application providers. And the other thing is, this sort of hybrid cloud, we aren't going to find NFV happening maybe between a data center and Amazon like we would in the enterprise, but we do see companies and telcos transitioning from VMware to OpenStack, for example. So just giving them a plain old OpenStack solution isn't necessarily good enough because they're busy trying to get their stuff there. And they're still running virtual network functions in multiple virtual environments. So in every case, there's this need for sort of a hybrid full stack environment. So that's kind of us in a nutshell.
Makes sense, makes sense. Well, I guess maybe taking a step back and looking at, I guess, at the pace and development of kind of this virtualized environment. I guess what's been your view of how that's evolved? I mean, it definitely seems like, it's come pretty rapidly from that data center world, the IT world, into the telecom space. I mean, over the past 2 or 3 years, it seems like every new acronym from that world has infiltrated the telecom space now, and
Yeah.
we're having to cover it on a daily basis, it seems like. I guess what's your general view of kind of how that's evolved, and I guess the pace of that development?
Right. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, we're getting a front row seat to this disruptive transition among telcos, and they're all handling it differently. Let me just say that way. I think that so they're all moving to NFV right now.
Yeah.
There's no question they're all going to go. Some are very far along, and others are still trying to spell it. It's very typical in these disruptions that you see a big gap get created between the haves and the have-nots,
Yeah.
and we're seeing that here. The major tier one providers have all developed some NFV product strategy and are starting to execute it. The smaller players are still in very early stages, and they're trying to develop their own NFV infrastructure, and I suspect many of them will not succeed in implementing their own. They're going to end up buying an end-to-end solution, working with a large integrator or service provider. The only benefit is even those small players are now going to have a wider group to pick from, right? It used to be, I'm going to get all my stuff from Nokia and Ericsson. Yep. Now they're going to get all their stuff from Nokia and Ericsson, even BNS, but also all of the normal data center infrastructure providers from Cisco to Dell to EMC are also players. So it's going to give them, even the small players who can't do it themselves, are still going to get more choice. So that's one big thing. Yeah. The second is telcos thought they're going to just jump into production with NFV. And as not historical software developers, they forgot the dev test cycle. Right? Oops. So now they're all, now they're all realizing, oh, I don't just put this stuff straight into production. I need development and test. And they're all realizing that with NFV comes DevOps. They can't do them separately. I would say my assessment is most telcos are not ready for production today. They are now realizing that to do large-scale software-based solutions, they not only need to develop their own internal DevOps capability, they also need to figure out how to be ecosystems players. Mm-hmm. So historically in telcos, you went to Ericsson and made Ericsson do everything for you, or you did it yourself, right? I mean, literally, Ericsson took the liability, everything. Now you got to run an ecosystem, and none of these guys are good ecosystem players. And so how do I onboard VNF, virtual network functions, from 50 or 80 or 100 different providers? As I'm onboarding them every day of the week in different versions, because they all want to be DevOps, how am I getting those aligned to know what I'm shipping is actually working? They don't know how to solve this problem. This is something they're very, I would say, relatively immature at, and they really need to come up the learning curve because they can't quite get into production long term if they can't figure out how to get that cycle working as well. So those are the things that I think are kind of what we're seeing happening. So.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I definitely know in talking to the operators out there who are moving down this model, that is a big concern is, that they're not really sure how this is going to work in their commercial environments. I mean, they've got these certain quality level agreements, and they've got the certain notions of what carrier grade means for them. And it's kind of, it's like a learning process. And obviously being able to work and going back to the sandbox environment, kind of the importance of that, being able to work with companies before going commercial seems like a pretty important part of all this. And again, there's always this issue about interoperability and making sure everything works together, because that does seem to be a core tenet of all of this, is the fact that all these things are supposed to be able to work together commercially and not have any issues, and it's in all, the open world and open source, everything like that. So I guess going back to what you guys are offering, then it's a pretty important time right now to really allow operators, vendors, these open source communities to all kind of really work on making these things work together before this, I guess, these commercial deployments. I guess talk a bit about the importance of these sandboxes to kind of make this all happen.
Right. So, we started trying to help them internally. So sandboxes are used to help them automate the dev test cycle and automate testing of virtual networks, right? Complex configurations with many virtual network devices in them. Mm-hmm. So that's great, and we're doing that with a lot of the telco companies today, where the sandbox is the enabler for every developer and engineer to do all of their development and testing in a real world environment. Mm-hmm. But this ecosystem play has been a kind of an interesting one. So we actually do that with a technology vendor today. Mm-hmm. Outside of telco. Cisco has a product called Cisco DevNet, which is mm-hmm. for all of their developer ecosystem. And every developer can get a sandbox that runs on top of, it runs on their internal data center at Cisco, but developers outside the company can get access to that equipment and the software for free through sandboxes, which is our software. And so that is now sort of, the telcos are kind of looking at that model and saying, we need something like that for our ecosystem. Mm-hmm. If we're going to onboard the VNFs from many different vendors, they all need to be able to, without either I'm going to do it all myself and I'm going to build a huge test lab, and they start looking at the cost and the requirements for that, and they don't want to take on the liability and responsibility of all the interoperability. They want one of the big parts of this disruption is flattening out the channel in a sense, and they want each VNF provider to do the work themselves. The only way to do that is to take that configuration and offer it as a service. So that's, sandboxes are great for that. So we are starting to see traction that, geez, maybe it's not just good enough to have a marketing program that said I have 80 NFV providers in my ecosystem. Maybe I actually have to let them certify and offer a way for them to certify. So now we're seeing the telcos start to act the way the more mature data center infrastructure providers act in providing all of the facility for that ecosystem. And as I said, Cisco, Huawei, and others actually already use sandboxing, our software, as a way to deliver that capability to their third-party partners via public cloud portals. So.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I mean, and I guess on this whole ecosystem topic as well, I mean, I remember, I've been covering this space for a couple of years now, and when I first started covering it, it seemed like every week there was either a new open source initiative or a vendor-specific ecosystem that was launched. And it seemed like, it was just this constant evolution or constant flow of new companies and new initiatives coming out. Yeah. And it seemed to me at the time that it was like, I mean, is this too much? I mean, do we need this many? Is this kind of making it worse? I guess, what's your view on that ability to kind of, obviously it's great to have everybody involved, but you also at the end of the day want to make sure that everybody kind of stays somewhat on the same page. And as you have these different organizations come out, it seems like that might be a little more difficult at times. I guess, what's your view on the ability for the industry to kind of remain focused, I guess, in light of, all these various initiatives that have come along?
Right. I mean, it's a really good point, because if you look at how NFV got launched and adopted by all the telcos, it was really because of the ETSI initiative, right? Because everyone bought into that and agreed to some common nomenclature and common delineation of who provides what function, right? And if we start to move away from that, which industries always seem to do, and get to fragmentation, we're going to have problems, right? And I think it still has to be played out. I mean, it's not clear yet if the system vendors are going to play that role, if the telcos themselves are going to play that role. They want to. AT&T wants to provide their entire ecosystem. Verizon wants to do the same thing, and that's eventually, the ecosystem that wins may be the winner in the marketplace because it has the capabilities to provide more services. So I think it's still up in the air. I don't know who should do it. I think doing it in different ways with different standards is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And it will ruin the starting point of ETSI and OpenStack. And it's something that commercial vendors always kind of want to do because they want to build differentiation. But I think you can build differentiation by attracting an ecosystem without being proprietary. I think that if you provide the lowest friction offering for small providers of network virtual functions, then they'll come to you and they'll work with you. So if you're the easiest partner to work with, if they can get their stuff onboarded and into your marketplace and into your services the most quickly, they're going to come to you. And I think this is where the telcos have to sort of learn to operate the way other parts of the market have, that you can't force them, but if you make it easy, they will come.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It does seem like that's kind of the challenge right now, is that everybody's seems like everybody's trying to start at a certain level, an open source type of level. But you're right, there is this history in the telecom space of adding your own little secret sauce to everything. That tends to kind of make things a little more proprietary, and then end of the day, that's not what people are looking for. So yeah, that does seem to be a big challenge, at least for telecom. It does seem like in the data center and IT world, they're farther along that process and kind of know that you can't really go that way. But yeah, it still seems in the telecom world, still being learned, I guess, trying to go through those different issues there.
Yeah, I mean, here's another example of that learning is that, I won't name any names, but one of the major telco providers issued an RFP not too long ago where for somebody to build an ecosystem test lab for onboarding DNFs on their behalf. And which is how they do it today. If it's physical equipment, they pay somebody, a third party, to do all that. Either they only use equipment from one vendor and then the vendor is required to do all the testing. Or when they go to vendors today, they force every vendor to build their own test lab at their own cost against their equipment. Yeah. Well, so they put out an RFP to do this for NFV. No one answered because no one wants to carry the liability of integrating hundreds of software companies and not have the major telco carry any of the responsibility. Again, the new model doesn't allow for that. Nobody's signing up for it. So they have to rethink the way they work with their partners and what the roles and responsibilities are between the various partners that are their supply chain.
Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, I'm guessing it's still good to have the carriers involved in this because at the end of the day, they are the customer for all this. But it still seems like then it's a bit of a learning process to how they are going to interact with their vendors on this whole process. Then.
Yeah. It's painful. Let's just put it that way.
Good to hear. Yes, yes. Well, another thing you talked a lot about too early on was the automation aspect of all this, and obviously in this move towards the software world, automation has become key. I mean, it's really going to be a key part of all of this. I mean, when operators talk about their plans for 5G or for IoT or whatever their evolution is going to be, automation has got to be a big part of this because you can't have somebody behind the scenes trying to manage billions of new devices connected to the network, or whether it's new technologies that are going to be used for 5G. I mean, you can't be a process like that. It's got to be a whole new way of doing things. I guess, how is the automation development coming along? Because it still seems like, again, in the IT and data center world, it seems like it's pretty well established and people are very comfortable with it. But in the telco world, it seems like that there's still some work to be done there. I mean, obviously, current engineers aren't maybe used to that kind of model, so they have to be brought along as well. I guess what's your view on how that's evolving in the telecom space?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fundamental point, is that you would think that the telcos, because their history is to provide services at large scale, you'd think they'd understand the sort of large scale phenomenon, but they haven't operated that way. They have had unionized operators sitting in the edge endpoints, sort of operating individual devices in a sense, and that's how they've gotten to scale. When you go to software, you have to be web scale the way Netflix and Google are web scale, and it's a different type of web scale. It goes to the application design, it goes to the way that you build your operations capability. And I always say at web scale, you cannot manage. You must automate. There is no such thing as management at web scale. It's not physically possible. Doesn't matter how many guys you have sitting on chairs. It just doesn't work. The famous story of Google with people driving around with shopping carts, pulling out disk drives, right? It just physically can't happen. Yeah. So they're now having to realize that automation at the level of how they run these services and operate them is really, really critical. So automation is critical. It's critical in the development process because there's no way they're going to onboard, test, certify, and push out all these network software functions quick enough without automation. And it's going to go into operations. Automation at the operations level is fundamental. They can try to do it the old way. In fact, they talk about using sort of their existing systems. Not going to happen. Never going to work. So, So they have to start with this new model, and of course that's a model we've always operated in, right? And when a lot of these guys, because they're not ready for production, we tell them, look, start with this automation to speed up test and development, right? Get comfortable with this level of automation where you create configurations on the fly, you tear them down. This is what they're going to do when they push into operations. They're going to push a new network function, which is actually, or network service, which is probably going to be built by a set of functions. So customer calls on the phone and says, I want XYZ. They're going to say, oh, that's a network service. It involves a load balancer and 2 caching systems and a router and a firewall and blah, blah, blah. That's going to be delivered as one service. That service is going to have to be automatically pushed into production for that set of users without a user intervening in the middle, without an operator, without any kind of manual setup. And that's a rethinking for them. It's a set of tools they don't really have exactly today, and it's the way we operate. We don't necessarily solve that exact problem of pushing a new service into production, but we operate in the right way, and the automation that they build when they're using sandboxes is the same model. It's the same type of automation that they're going to need to push into production.
Interesting. So obviously a lot of work still needs to be done on this. I mean, I know, again, when I started following this and everybody was talking about, commercial virtualization deployments by 2017, it was going to be everywhere. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done, but progress is being made, it sounds like, at least. I mean, we're working out the issues at this point still, and obviously a lot of issues, so a lot of work still being done there for that. So, but I guess maybe looking forward a little bit over the next 6 to 12 months or so, I mean, what's maybe one of the big challenges or two that you guys see in the market, or maybe even specifically to you guys, that will kind of make for long weeks for you of work or long nights of work there? What do you guys, I guess, see as the big challenges for you?
Yeah. So I mean, we're over the hump now because we added application templating, and one of the things that we do is we model infrastructure. It's not that we're not infrastructure as code. You hear a lot about infrastructure as code. What does that mean? That means you write scripts that talk to your hardware. We do that, but we don't require our users to do that because that's a little low level, right? So we layer a little model on top of that. Why is that relevant in telco? Well, it's especially relevant there because when I take a virtual router versus a physical router, I have to first deploy it like it's an application. It's a VM. I got to tell my virtualization system, OpenStack, please deploy this VM. Now, OpenStack doesn't know it's a router. So OpenStack doesn't know how to set up network connections to it. It just knows I'll deploy it. Great. Now what do I do? Well, we add a model to that says, hey, by the way, we remember it's a virtual router and it has these characteristics. It's Juniper virtual router that has a certain structure. That's built into our data model. So now we'll deploy it automatically through automation as a VM onto OpenStack, right? But once it's deployed there, we now can apply a second level of automation that says, oh, and by the way, we know it's a virtual router. So let's go ahead and set up some network connections to make the sandbox be fully configured. And that's the value that we add. So it took us some work to sort of figure out that two-step process. For physical devices, it was sort of get the device, lock the device, connect the ports. With virtual, you have to think about it differently. You have to add this layer of, at one level, I'm talking to it like it's a VM. I'm deploying it, I'm starting it, I'm stopping it, I'm migrating it. And at another level, hey, it's a router. I talk to it like a router. I connect up its ports. I do this, router type functions. So we built all that into our core capability. And so, we're really sort of a unique solution when what you're trying to deploy as an app is in fact pretending to be something else, like a virtual network device. So that was a big struggle and challenge for us internally. But what I think is happening with telcos is also happening across the industry, that everyone's becoming a software company, and that's their big challenge, right? And they need to change everything they do. They have to change their practices for development. They have to develop new expertise because they're not creating hardware, they're creating software. It's a completely different expertise base. They need to implement DevOps or they'll never get to speed. They need this ecosystem we talked about. They need to operate at scale, web scale, which we talked about, which is completely a different way of managing. frankly, for operators, the fact that they're unionized is an issue, because how do you shift from what one company told us, and this isn't a telco, it's true in the enterprise space. Their goal is to replace 20 operators with one developer who automates everything so that there is no operation. So in telco, the getting rid of 20 operators and replacing them with one developer is really actually a real fundamental problem, given unionization, and they're very restricted in what they can do. And then, of course, all their processes need to change. The way they roll something out to their edge, centers, and the way they train operators, all this stuff has to change fundamentally. And, of course, their relationships with partners. So pretty much everything they do has to change in this cycle, which is why it's not happening as fast as they want it to.
I was going to say, it sounds so easy. I mean, that's just a few little minor things here and there. That's not a big deal, right? But you're right. I mean, the retraining in and of itself is a huge part of this, because, excuse me, one person I was talking about this, they were mentioning that kind of the dirty little secret about automation or about virtualization is that it really gets rid of jobs. And so just that alone is going to be a huge challenge for a lot of these companies out there. Obviously, it'll make their operations leaner and more agile. But I mean, that alone is going to be a huge hurdle. Not even taking into account everything else you've mentioned as well. So still a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, we have customers who tell us, we have a big telco in England or UK that basically told us that they have a lab that had a bunch of guys running around cabling stuff every time they set up a service, and they've been running their lab with us for, 4 years, and they don't have anyone. It's a dark lab now. Now, their goal wasn't to get rid of those 5 to 10 people. Their goal was to repurpose them to a value-added function, something other than cable swapping, right? And they definitely have. So, but, and that wasn't their initial goal was to speed up tests, run more tests successfully. But the end result was that the lab is dark. The guy who runs the lab now can sit at home, drink coffee, and run his lab because everything is automated. So for sure, those are changes that are going to happen in the process of getting to speed.
Yeah. It's all part of the big process to make these operators more competitive in the environment out there. I mean, it's what they have to do. I mean, it's, you can't have 5G, IoT, you can't have all these new things coming down the pike without this kind of movement. So obviously that's just part of the process.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the most interesting things that I think happened this year that went almost unnoticed was that Google announced they were deploying and using a vCPE in production. And I don't know of a telco that's actually doing that today in full production. Mm-hmm. And I sort of said, holy cow, meanwhile, while all the telecommunication industry hampered by unions, hampered by regulatory requirements, et cetera, and legacy, as they try to figure out how to transition to the modern world, they may get leapfrogged by people who can't even spell telco and who become our providers in the future. So they are absolutely under tremendous pressure.
Yeah, it's definitely a changing world out there, that's for sure, it seems like. But well, Joan, definitely a great insight on this today. Obviously, it's a lot happening and a lot of changes still ahead, but we definitely appreciate the great insight on this today. Thanks so much for the time and information. And hopefully we touch base again soon as this kind of whole market evolution continues to roll down the road. So definitely appreciate the time today.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks again. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check out our next show when we speak with Juniper Networks on delivering NFV solutions to address different types of operational models.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com, and on Twitter @Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.